I am now ready to, now that the buttonholes are both made and cut open, I am ready to attach the lining for my hood to the hood itself. And again, for this one I've decided to put the lining recessed, and so the lining itself, if you look, is smaller than the hood. That's because I'm going to have the entire casing when I'm through sticking out here beyond the hood, and so it'll be a little bit smaller. So you've got to take time, measure, and be sure that you cut out the front, cut out the extra fabric that you don't need. And then you will pin the lining to your hood right sides together, so along this front edge, all the way around, line that up, and sew them together. If you are making the type where they're going to come out and match and meet that way, most of those patterns have you sew it at 5/8 of an inch and then trim and grade that seam. If you are recessing it, most of the patterns is 1/4 of an inch seam, and mine is recessed. All right, so we're ready to start the beginning of the hood now. It's going to be sewn at 1/4 of an inch, so I drop my presser foot, bring my needle down, just begin sewing back stitch, and I'm just going to sew the entire front of the hood, making sure those two edges stay aligned. And we'll sew all the way around the front of that. And so I will keep sewing and then I'll chat with you about what happens next. All right, so it was sewn at that 1/4 of an inch, sewn on the front. Now you're going to turn the hood right side out. Again, if you had chosen to do the type of lining where it met on the edge, you would now be pinning and getting it so it's just barely favored, so that your lining is just barely on the inside and doesn't show on the outside, and you would pin this in place. But mine is recessed, and so I will have a 1-inch casing on the inside here. And pin that in place. And then you can see on the outside, my buttonhole will wind up centered inside that casing when the time comes. And so you will take and pin and measure. And depending upon what kind of fabric you chose for your lining, if it's also very bulky, you may actually want to take this seam allowance and open it and have it be split on the side so that you've got the bulk distributed between the seam. Where my lining is very light, I'm going to go ahead and let both seam allowances head towards my hood, because the fabric that I chose to line this hood with is a very lightweight fabric and isn't going to add any bulk to that. The pinning here is very important. Don't make this a speed type of thing, and don't go, oh, 3 pins is good, I'm ready to go. Actually put your pins fairly close together, because you are going to stitch from the inside of the hood, be stitching in the ditch here of this seam, but it will show up as top stitching on the outside of your hood. And so you've got to make sure that you really are going to stay parallel at that 1 inch. And so take the time to put several pins in, make sure that you're accurate, and get that pinned all the way around, and that that seam is laying flat, either both going the same direction or open, whichever you chose, and that you've kept that way the entire way around your hood. And so I am going to pin the rest of this and then show you what to do. All right, I have got the casing pinned, and I've made sure, used my hem gauge and made sure I'm staying the same width. And again, like I said earlier, I'm going to sew from the inside, but it shows up as top stitching on the outside. And so I want to be careful and make sure that I'm actually sewing straight. I can backstitch here because it will wind up down inside of a seam allowance, so I can backstitch top and bottom. And then I'm just going to stay and stitching in the ditch there. And your stitch plate actually has a 1-inch line right there on the side. And so you can kind of make sure that you're staying at 1 inch as you're sewing. And make sure that you're staying in that ditch on the inside edge. If you didn't line it, if you didn't line your hood, you would have turned this edge under 1 1/4 inches, which is what I've got. I've got that 1/4 inch seam allowance there. And you would now stitch it, same thing, this inch from the edge. You would follow that 1 inch line that you've got there on your stitch plate, and you would be sewing 1 inch from that edge. If you did the lining where you're meeting out here at the style edge of the hood, you would have trimmed and graded that seam allowance and gotten it down to just less than 3/8 and just less than 1/4, and then turned back and pinned, and you would still now be stitching 1 inch from the leading edge of your hood. And so it doesn't matter which method you chose for your hood. As you're doing the casing, this casing winds up being 1 inch wide. Alright, as you approach the other side, when you get down towards the front, you will do the same thing, back stitch to the other end. And you noticed at both ends I had one pin head in the opposite direction. That was so I could check and look back inside and make sure that when I stitched here, that buttonhole was going to wind up centered in my casing. Okay, so there's my edge, there's my stitching, my buttonhole winds up centered right there, halfway in the middle. And so I like to stick one pin the opposite direction so that I can see that yes, my buttonhole does wind up centered.